Does that need to be connected?
Oh, so this is not connected. That's my laptop.
That's my laptop, so I'll be using it.
And Jonathan's
Okay.
first.
I'm
so it's
not
fine.
doing a
Okay,
PowerPoint, but I've
okay,
just got my notes on there.
Right.
Is this
Order. Order. Thank you.
fantastic? Welcome back, everyone. So we moved from this morning session where we looked at 4 separate contexts to this afternoon session where we'll be looking at cross-cutting themes, again, across local, national, and supranational scales, specifically NGOs, education, psychology, and youth. And so first up to speak, we have Jonathan Cohen, the Executive Director of Conciliation Resources.
Thanks a lot, Abigail. And I'm conscious that I'm speaking first after lunch and many of you will be getting ready for your snooze. So I would be if I were in your place. So I'll do my best to try and keep myself and all of you awake. And I'm very conscious, being back in Oxford, that 30 years ago, exactly 30 years ago, I finished a thesis here writing about how people in the Soviet Union had fought in the Second World War and adapted to civilian life after the war, the process of demobilization. And I had the very good fortune immediately as I finished that thesis to stumble into a job at International Alert and to set up a program for what we then called conflict resolution in the former Soviet Union, and particularly in the Caucasus, just as the war in Abkhazia was breaking out. And that's actually a context that's, I suppose, dominated my life since. And sort of looking back at that time, a couple of us were just reflecting at lunch that in a way the 90s were a bit of a boom period for conflict resolution, peace building, and the 20s, our current decade, feels a bit like a doom period with the sort of unholy trinity of COVID, conflicts, and climate change dominating our thinking. And so what I'm going to reflect on a little bit in my presentation is less of the wonderfully eloquent reflections that we had this morning, but perhaps a slightly more prosaic perspective of what does it mean to be involved in running a peace-building organization. And so in a way I stand here as what I see as a peace-building bureaucrat, sadly. I'm less doing the hands-on work these days, but hopefully doing a reasonably good job to facilitate a fantastic team of 80 colleagues who are out there doing the peace building work and engaging with communities and contexts and complexity in those endeavors, and working with, at any given time, 60 to 80 partner organizations living the conflicts that they're trying to transform. And I'm extraordinarily conscious that the work that we do, and when I think about trying to answer this question, who builds peace, that the people who build peace are the people who, I think of people who are doing on one level ordinary and on another level extraordinary work on a daily basis, and tragically who too often give their lives for this. A very dear friend of mine just dropped dead last November, younger than me, 52, but he had worked himself to an early grave. Others, and we all know them, have been killed in the pursuit of trying to build peace. And I think, we need to reflect that it is a high stakes endeavor to try and build peace, not just in political or legal terms, but in terms of life and death. And I'm more conscious than ever that this is a work of many hands. Building peace is not something that you do alone. And there are many angles to it. So I speak from a perspective of conciliation resources, peace building, mediation support, NGO. But I'm very conscious that we do this in John Paul this morning used the term ecosystem. And I was thinking of using it in terms of the ecosystem in which we operate alongside intergovernmental organizations, multilateral organizations, government, states, non-state armed groups, and civil society in its manifold existence, and the sorts of organizations to movements, activists, to bureaucrats who pursue this effort. And I think of the words of my friend and colleague Andy Carl, who founded Conciliation Resources 28 years ago. And Andy had a mantra that the people most affected and often most insightful about what needs to be done to address conflict are often the least well-resourced to do so. And in some ways, that's how Andy came up with what many people consider the strange name Conciliation Resources. And I think this idea of how do you provide resources to the people who are most exposed, most vulnerable, but also most invested in change, how do you provide them resources to enable them to do this in a sustained way? Now, in recent years, quite rightly, the discourse around local peace building has become very powerful, and it's a very dynamic one, and I think critical to our understanding of what it is we're all involved in. But I also think it's really important that we don't make a fetish of the notion of the local. On the one hand, I find it sometimes can be terribly patronizing to talk of local peace builders and then these internationals who come in. On one level, we're all local, and we should be very wary of that dichotomy. But I also think that it touches on what John Paul spoke about when he spoke about the dichotomy between insider partial mediators and outside neutral actors. I hope we've learned that the outsider multi-partial actor is not neutral about the violations and the abuses and the butchery that they witness. But if you choose to be a peace builder, if you choose to support processes of mediation, you do sometimes have to step back and not take sides. And that can be painful, can be uncomfortable, but you need to think about what's your role, what's your contribution. But I also want to think about the term local on another level. The societies that become immersed in conflict do so for a myriad of different reasons. Geopolitics has been mentioned, and I think that's a powerful driver, and it's one that is on some levels inescapable. I was in an event last weekend with someone who used the term the geopolitical squeeze, and I think it's a very powerful one. But at the same time, those people who are striving for change within conflict-ridden societies, they are often asking for, they need external support. Societies get enmeshed in conflict because, unfortunately, of the dysfunctions that people within struggle to resolve on their own. So the question is, how do you bring support from outside in a respectful, meaningful way that sustains effective peace building? And one of the things that we think about very deeply at our organization is the question of what is meaningful and effective partnership in the peace building sphere. And in some ways, I think that relationship between the people whose conflict it is, who are trying to transform their conflict, and the people from outside, how they work together, that relationship is part of the alchemy of what it is to build peace. So when I ask myself who builds peace, I think of the multiple partnerships that we're involved in. And a few years ago, we did some research to try and unpack what our understanding of partnership in peace building is. There's been a lot of work on partnership in multiple spheres. And we want to think, what does it mean for us as a peace building organization? And we came up with 4 findings that I think were very important for our sense of who we are as an organization. So I want to share those with you and then talk a little bit about some of the specific contributions that can be made. One is what we call an accompaniment approach. And we think this is particularly suited to what we recognize as being long-term and adaptive peace building, around the genuine commitment to working with people, but to co-creating what it is you do and the strategies that are designed and developed, and really genuinely thinking about what does it mean to provide the space that gets beyond outputs and deliverables that all too often get talked about, to focus on the change. Secondly, I think there's a question around the diverse set of relationships with different organizations that have different mandates and profiles. And that can be a real strength in peace building when you have partners who amplify each other's strengths and when you have a genuine consideration for what complementarity means. Thirdly, we're conscious that there's a balance between remote partnering and being present. we don't have offices in all the contexts where we work. We do in some, and we always have to think, why are we there? What are we seeking to achieve in being there? And how do we navigate the politics, which is essential for the people within their own societies building peace, but it's also essential for you as an outsider coming in. You bring reputational challenges for your partners. You bring questions around the privileged access that you as an outsider, as an international, often have. And how does that jeopardize what people within their own societies do? And how do you use that privileged access in the interests of people within society, not within your own interests? And that takes a lot of choreography and intent to ensure that unheard voices and marginalized voices get given due recognition. And then fourthly, I think there's an issue around balancing the contractual aspects of partnership and the aspiration and activism for change. On the one level, as an outside organization that often has the funds channeled through you, there's a question of being able to act as a buffer to insulate people within conflict regions from some of the complex and competing demands imposed by donors. But you have to balance that with making sure that it's not your agenda you're working to, that you're really listening to the agendas of the people who are seeking change with their own society. And then I think this question of how you navigate the overly prescriptive approaches of donors, be it in the increasingly arduous compliance and regulatory domain that we constantly have to struggle with, be it the results-based monitoring and evaluation that is so often out of tune with the non-linear nature of conflict in volatile contexts. These are things that become a joint struggle, but the truth is, oftentimes as an organization based in London or wherever it might be, you're dealing with this constantly. Whereas if you're working with a community group in Northern Central African Republic, it's a discourse that they have no experience of. And so you can become the translator of how to deal with these sorts of issues. But and hopefully we use this role to also try and influence the donors to think about how they use their resources and how they use their influence to bring about change, to try and change some of these often absurd approaches. Can't say we've been hugely successful to date, but that's another story. So what is it that an NGO like ours brings to the process of peace when we work with colleagues in conflict contexts? Of course, it will vary from organization to organization, and it will vary from context to context. But I want to just think of four that I hope we try and do well. One is bringing comparative experience. We work in some 20 contexts. We also produce a journal called Accord on the practice of building peace and what is effective, what is less effective. So we bring a lot of comparative experience to the table. And I was reminded in one of the breaks this morning, talking with John Alderdice, that when John was Speaker of the Assembly in Northern Ireland in the early 2000s, we brought several groups of Georgian and Abkhaz civic and political actors to Belfast to try and give them a different perspective on security, economic, cultural, political issues as they impacted on their context. And John shared his vision of how you move from violence to politics as a means to address conflict. And that was a very powerful notion for our Georgian and Abkhaz colleagues. And so being able to bring that comparative perspective, and one has to be careful with study visits because they've become a bit of a go-to tool over the years, and they can be a waste of money sometimes. You've really got to think about them in a thoughtful, planned way to make them useful. But I also think about the comparative experience you can bring, for instance, work we're doing, Tanya mentioned work we're doing in the Somali regional state of Ethiopia, where we've been involved for more than a decade. And it's actually one of the situations where we had the good fortune to help the signing of a peace agreement. And that doesn't happen very often, I have to say. But we're now working with colleagues there on efforts to look at how survivors how victims can influence the process of transitional justice. And we brought those colleagues into contact with people doing this in a variety of different places so they can see what's useful for them and what lessons they might want to learn. A second role after the comparative experience is that I think as an outsider, you can play a really important role in supporting to bridge divides. This can be very hard for insiders to do alone. Sometimes the structure of a conflict just makes it impossible. Now I think of work that I've been intimately involved in the Georgian-Abkhaz conflict, where you couldn't just walk across the divide. You did need some kind of external facilitation to bring people together. Likewise in Kashmir. So in both those contexts, we've been involved in long-standing dialogue initiatives across the conflict divide, but actually initiatives of multiple levels, bringing people together in political dialogue, bringing people together in educational initiatives, in Kashmir, facilitating a long-standing but currently blocked process of a joint chamber of commerce and industry, the only cross-line of control body that has existed in Kashmir. And this has been us as outsiders being able to play that facilitative role to bring people together. I think of connections within societies that are fragmented. So I've got colleagues in the Central African Republic at the moment working on what we call a decentralized dialogue, recognizing the dilemmas that was spoken of earlier of the center and the peripheries of states, and how do you bridge those divides? And we find that our partners in the Central African Republic need external support to facilitate that. Alone, they've not been able to raise the resources or the access to make it happen. So through partnership, we brought it to a new level. Thirdly, I think about the way we can provide challenge and spaces where people can think differently. And I think that one of the elements of that is, how do you make the process of change less exclusive? How do you bring different voices in that might not have that opportunity? And again, our work with the ONLF in Ogaden, I think, has been quite instructive for us on that. And then a fourth area where I think we bring a lot, and it's been spoken about earlier today, is this question of access to resources and the nature of financing peace building, which in so many ways is demanding and inadequate. And there are challenges around financial cycles that John Paul spoke about 10-year funding. Well, those of you who are involved in peace building know that's a holy grail. And you know what we do, and I think of our experience of working in a Georgian-Abkhaz context for 30 years, well, 25 years at CR, 5 years beforehand, we have to piece together a mosaic of funding, and you're constantly trying to bridge gaps and keep the resources going so you don't lose momentum in the initiatives, and that you don't projectize what you're doing, that you are thinking strategically. Well, the funding environment makes that really hard. And we have to constantly ask ourselves, are we diverting resources from people in the context who are trying to bring about change, or are we adding value? So what makes this work happen? What's the glue? We've heard a lot about relationships today, and quite rightly. John Paul spoke about curiosity, humility, and patience. I'd add to that durability, empathy, and generosity. I think the commitment to being there through fallow times is critical to building the credibility to be able to play a role. I think questions of coordination and complementarity are essential. Undoubtedly, NGOs tread on one another's toes. But I think where we stand today compared to when I got involved 30 years ago, let alone 10 years ago, the collaboration and the coordination between multiple organizations has moved on enormously. And I think there's a lot further to go, but I'm heartened by the way I see people working together. Tanya spoke about successes and failures. And clearly we don't always achieve what we're striving for. But we do know that commitment to stay engaged in processes is imperative. And to do this, we need to navigate the politics. And as Andre rightly emphasized, peace building is fundamentally political. Too many donors talk about people-to-people engagement as if you can detach it from the politics of a situation. And David Bloomfield, speaking about reconciliation in a publication of ours a few years ago, said that people think reconciliation is soft. and I would apply that to people diplomacy. They think it's soft, it's easy. You can bring that into a process that's protracted and intractable. Our job is to find traction, and reconciliation and people-to-people engagement is not soft. It's the hardest thing imaginable. And in a world where we see governments throwing money at the militarized solutions of conflicts, we need to find a way back to those soft issues that are actually the essence of what peace building is. And so the final comment I'd make is that in running a peace building organization and being run by my colleagues much of the time, I think the critical dimension we have to hold on to is thinking about what our values are, what we stand for, and to ensure that we don't allow the transactional nature of relationships to surpass the transformative aspirations that we have in being involved in peace building. Thank you.
Next, we have Associate Professor in Education, Peace and Conflict at the University of Bristol, Julia Paulson.
Right. Thank you very much, everyone, for the day so far. And thanks to Oxpeace and Rodemos de Diálogo for the invitation to be here. Andre invited me to come and talk for 15 minutes about peace education, which is a very daunting task, even when it came through in the email. And then I got the program and saw that Jean-Paul Liederach would be introducing the day. And he wrote a book, Educar para la Paz, in 1984, which raises a number of the tensions that I'm going to discuss today. And I think that's an interesting point, that we're, still discussing many things that have been in the literature since Jean-Paul wrote that book, since Paulo Freire wrote before him, since Antonio Gramsci wrote before him. So many of the tensions that I'm going to raise in this presentation are things that those of you interested in education, and all of us who've been through some form of education, have probably encountered and thought about. So that's an interesting reflection for us, I guess, around the ways in which we're still talking about and not moving past some of these tensions. So thinking about how to fill this 15 minutes and this daunting task, I thought I would really reflect upon this question about who builds peace, and these and the prompting that the conference has asked us to do around relationships at international, national, regional, and local levels. So starting with the international, there's a really strong conviction, and this is just epitomized by the quote that we see here from former Secretary General Kofi Annan, that education has a crucial role to play in building peace. There's an assumption and a conviction and a certainty, in fact, that education does build peace. And we hear this time and time again, despite the fact that there's not necessarily convincing evidence of that this is the case, particularly looking at formal education. And we mentioned the Ukraine situation earlier, and there's enormously high levels of education in both Russia and Ukraine, formal education. So this conviction that going through some form of formal education will necessarily be peace building is one that we need to be critical of, I think. Nonetheless, there's been huge effort, particularly this century, to generate resources for and build evidence around this conviction. And we've talked a lot about peace building actors at the conference so far. There's also been a lot of work in education from development and humanitarian actors. So I'll try to briefly outline the contours of this conviction at international level. So in the international development sector, education has long been seen as central from both economic understandings of development, and that education builds human capital, and from human rights understandings of development, in that education is an enabling right that helps us to then access other rights via becoming educated people. And conflict within international development understandings is understood as development in reverse, to borrow a World Bank term, and therefore its restoration is seen as an important peace dividend in the reconstruction after conflict, again, to use World Bank language. Since the turn of the century, the protracted nature of conflict and ensuing displacement has required humanitarian actors also to expand their remits into education. So education is now considered a fourth pillar of humanitarian response, alongside food and water, health, and shelter. And this means that humanitarian actors are now involved in providing education, as well as providing other forms of humanitarian assistance. So we see that education is squarely a part of international response to conflict by both development and humanitarian actors. Development actors have concentrated on expanding access to education and improving its quality, including within the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, where Target 4.7 explicitly includes the provision of education to build a culture of peace and nonviolence, which is a first for these education and goal-related agendas to explicitly include peace education within the goal targets. Humanitarian actors, like I said, have become education providers, delivering education in refugee and displacement situations, and also increasingly developing strategies for longer-term responses, including the integration of displaced learners into national systems. Now, critics, including those concerned with peace and peace education, I'm looking at Hillary, who sat here, and her colleagues are here, another daunting part of my responsibility given the expertise in the room. But critics concerned with peace education have argued that these development approaches have promoted and expanded a universalized approach to education that's more concerned with getting children's bums on the seats and instrumental learning outcomes than with relevant and culturally sustained forms of learning. And the introduction of humanitarian actors into the education field adds additional challenges because they've raised the challenges for them of introducing education work and working with what they describe as a political thing, which education, of course, inevitably is. But humanitarian actors find that working in education compromises their neutrality, and therefore they can't discuss things like how historical narratives are taught. In fact, it's easier to not teach history whatsoever in order to maintain this concern with humanitarian neutrality. So in general, there's questions around these ideas of neutrality and detachment from politics and humanitarian work, but then trying to maintain that sort of false, arguably, commitment to neutrality and depoliticization in the education sector raises additional challenges, especially for peace education. And this means, sorry, now I've gone off my notes. Where are we? So taken together, we've got this universalist approach to what education is and what it looks like and how it's delivered and what the important things that learners should take from it are, plus a commitment in some cases to neutrality in its delivery. And this means that discussions of peace beyond the most generalized understandings are often impossible in education situations, in international approaches to teaching about peace and conflict. This is evident, this kind of very toned down and neutral and content-free almost understanding of peace is evident in lots of the internationally produced materials, and I've got a couple of examples up here. So we see peace education when included in these kind of interventions, which it often isn't, but when included, it tends to focus on human rights knowledge, on attitudinal change, on individual level skills, and it's very conceptualized in terms of the locus of change on the individual learner as a detached, autonomous person whose attitudes will generate peace if those attitudes can be shaped in this universalized understanding of human rights education. So we really see the individual learner and their psychology as the locus of change and the place where peace is built, without an attention to conflict analysis, to contextual specificity, or to structural change. So that's a brief picture of this kind of level of international commitment, which is very strong and striking, but has these tensions, which, as I mentioned, have been highlighted for a long time. When we move beyond commitments and convictions and goals at the international level, however, it becomes clear how implicated education is with conflict and violence, and therefore how important attention to conflict analysis, structural change, and contextual dynamics are to the processes and prospects of meaningful peace education. So on this slide, we've got a smaller photo of a group of Palestinian students and their teacher. And they're holding their lesson, not in their school, but at a checkpoint, because they were denied the possibility to pass the checkpoint on that particular day and get to their school. The other photo is from a beautiful series by Colombian photographer Juan Manuel Echeverria called Silencios. And it's one of a series of photographs of schools, empty schools, in communities displaced by armed conflict. And there's a whole series, and they're stunning photos. So both of these examples, I think, are really evocative demonstrations of the ways that children and young people learn about conflict and peace, not from those universalized descriptions of what human rights are, but from their own encounters and lived experience with conflict and peace, and the ways in which violence enter their schools and their classrooms and their daily lived experience. So through very direct forms of violence like we see in these slides, and also through normalized forms of structural and cultural violence that can shape the kinds of schools that they're able to access, who they do and do not encounter in their classrooms. It was really striking when we heard from Brandon earlier that it's still 93% of children, and I think it was 93, was it? Yeah, thanks. Of students in Northern Ireland who are still learning in segregated schools according to their faith groups. So this chance or not chance to encounter others in school is really important, I think. And the kinds of knowledge and histories that are included and excluded from their curricula at school. So just highlighting the ways in which schooling transmits both direct and indirect or structural cultural forms of violence that young people learn about and encounter and either have tools or don't have tools to make sense of, thanks at least in part to whether or not there's some form of peace education that can offer those tools. So a pre-cooked, to borrow a term from friend and anthropologist Jason Hart, who's done a lot of work with Palestinian young people and who is the person who's given me this photo. He says a pre-cooked approach to peace education curriculum is really unlikely to help children make sense of these experiences or to provide them with a sense of their potential roles in explaining them. And as Rula, a Palestinian girl who spoke to Jason about her experiences crossing checkpoints to get to school, said, they talk about child rights, but they don't see our situation. So this leaves a critically oriented researcher interested in peace education, pointing to these tensions and challenges that have been pointed to for decades within a system. And I think this has been an interesting theme throughout today as well, our roles within a system that we're connected to and also complicit with. We've talked a lot about connections and relations and webs, but less about complicity within networks of geopolitics like Andre was pointing us to. So I think there's interesting reflections for those of us who inhabit more international roles, maybe particularly there. But yes, so the critical researcher is left pointing to tensions, as Paulo Freire did, as we already mentioned decades ago, and calling for the kind of radical transformations of education systems that we've not regularly witnessed. So I wonder sometimes, for example, if in Colombia, there were an attention to structural change, structural reform of an education system that has huge inequalities between urban and rural in terms of the outcomes of education and the opportunities that are delivered, and really great socioeconomic segregation in terms of private and public schooling. What if that kind of transformation were one of the institutions of a peace process? But these kind of radical transformations of whole education systems are not common. So calling for those also offers a frustrated suggestion to the teacher who's trying to deliver and make a difference and really committed to delivering peace education to their students. So, and to practitioners who are committed to the potential of education to build peace, which is certainly a real potential despite the challenges and tensions that we've raised. So I've had this amazing opportunity recently to try to move beyond that paralysis of pointing out a lot of problems, calling for radical change that is needed, but hard to see happening, to try to do something that I think echoes with some of what Jonathan was saying around transferring resources and supporting educators who are starting from a point of analysis of those tensions and then trying to offer something that develops peace education in creative ways. So this is a project with colleagues, initially started with colleagues in Colombia, Cambodia, Pakistan, and Uganda, and now expanded to 18 countries, that takes these tensions in peace education as a starting point, transfers resources, in this case from the United Kingdom Research Institute's Global Challenges Research Fund, to educators and activists who are delivering peace education approaches that start from this seeing the situation of their learners that Rula was talking about before, the student that I quoted from Palestine. So seeing the situation and then trying to develop some kind of approach to peace education. And the project is called the Education, Justice and Memory Network. We have the privilege of having £2 million to work with on this project over 4 years, which again is not a long enough time frame, but in research funding world is also longer than we often have. And it includes working with colleagues here in the UK, which I think is really important to say and was a real challenge for our funders who want 1 minute, that's perfect, I can do it, who want this money to be transferred to places that have problems with conflict, which is not the United Kingdom in their opinion. But we've managed to push back against that and work with colleagues in the UK who are addressing the complete absence of peace education in our education system here, despite many divisions and inequalities and injustices. So we are working to develop creative approaches to peace education, as I said, and they include a clear focus on understanding past violence and injustice experienced by learners and their forebears, and exploring those legacies in the present. And because I have 1 minute, let me just really quickly highlight 3 things. We're just beginning to try to think about how we synthesize this work. But one important thing to say is that most, not all, but many of the projects are not working formally in schools. Some of them are conceptualizing their work as directly about repairing the damage that formal schools have done to the young people that they're working with. They interestingly, while they don't reject the label of peace education entirely, peace is not one of the most frequent words that they use when describing their methodologies and goals. So they talk about healing, repairing, redressing, decolonizing, unraveling, remembering, storytelling, co-creating, et cetera, et cetera. And these are perhaps steps towards peace, or perhaps priorities that are the most important at this moment for this work. And finally, in the same way that universalized approaches fail to see the situations of violence, direct and indirect, that shape learners' understandings of peace and conflict, they also fail to see the daily encounters with peace and the ways that young people are building peace in their daily interactions, in their relationships, their feelings, and their dreams. And so these projects are working to sustain those daily peace interactions, to amplify them, and to learn from them. So that's it.
And next we welcome Uframir, who is the founder of the International Center for Peace Psychology.
Hello, am I audible? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Before we begin, I would like to invite you to quickly stretch if you need to, or take a few conscious breaths, because I understand it gets really tiring when we're sitting for a long time. And just kind of notice what you're feeling right now as you're sitting in this room. And we've been talking about peace since 9:30 in the morning. If I were to ask you to quickly maybe close your eyes if you want to, if you feel comfortable. Imagine what peace means to you today. How do you see it? How do you visualize it? What colors, patterns, shapes form the idea of peace as you understand it today? And if I can just again invite you to come back to where we're sitting right now, that'd be great. Before I begin, I also want to acknowledge that it's a huge privilege speaking here today, not just for the obvious reasons. I come from Kashmir, and being able to speak here freely, or in some ways freely, is a huge privilege that a lot of my friends and colleagues back home don't have right now. So I just wanted to acknowledge that before I begin. Who builds peace? I honestly don't know. It's a question that I've struggled with since I began this work a long time ago. And I'm not here to claim that I'm building peace back home. I'm just going to share here what I do in peace psychology and my very humble reflections, learnings, and some unlearnings as well, most importantly, that I have understood and realized through this journey. And mostly as a practitioner, because that's where my heart and soul is. If you had asked me what peace psychology is maybe 10 years ago, or how we built peace, I think I would have given you a very flowery answer. But over the years, I think the understanding obviously has evolved. And as I've tried to understand more of peace, I feel like I don't understand a lot of it. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I just have a slide. Because I was busy getting visa work and traveling work. No kidding. This is just to kind of give you a context of where I come from, and just so that we get the title right, because I had somebody ask me once, what is bees psychology? Because they kind of interpreted peace as bees. And I was like, oh, that would be interesting to reflect on. So peace psychology kind of happened to me. It wasn't something that I aspired to do. 17 years ago in my high school, I went to a high school called United World College. It was started by a German educationalist who thought maybe peace education could be a way to unite people. So it's a chain of high schools around the world right now. I went to the one in India. And at the age of 16, 17, I took psychology and started getting trained in conflict resolution, mediation, conflict management, and other techniques. And it kind of broadened the world for me. And as I asked myself bigger questions of what it means to be a Kashmiri and how can I kind of contribute to the community I am a part of. So that's where the whole idea of peace psychology came in. And it was also inspired by the fact that I'm talking 17 years ago when we were hardly talking about psychology and mental health, at least in my context. And I saw there were people obviously working on these initiatives, and there were people separately working on peace building. And I felt like there was a gap. And I wanted to somehow bridge that gap in my own humble ways. I didn't exactly know how to go about that, but peace psychology felt like the most relevant thing I could do, especially because there was a lack of holistic, contextualized, decolonized approach to healing, justice, and peace building. So I wanted to basically create a support system that was relevant to people in their conflict zones, just like in Kashmir. My foundational understanding began with the understanding that humans are complex. And so is peace, and so is conflict. We could go to the moon and probably to the Mars in the next few years, and I think we'll still end up with conflicts. So I started with the understanding that we need to probably give people skills so that they can at least cope with the ramifications of living in conflict zones. Not putting too much onus on them only, but I think that's a kind of a beginning step. And on the ground, a lot of my work has been trying to understand how to respond to the conflict when it changes every day, when the dynamics of conflict changes every day. What do you do as a practitioner to support the people, to support the community, which you are also a part of? And in that, I've realized something like neutrality doesn't really exist. because there will be times when you will react even as a peace builder. You will have your heart broken and your soul shaken. And that happens actually all the time. And for me, peace has always been a process and not a product. So I come from a very positive peace building kind of an approach, where somebody actually asked me, how do you build peace in a place with an ongoing conflict? I think it was an important question. And most of the times when I'm not in existential crisis, I think the answer is quite simple: by doing what is needed on the ground. And I'm just here to share some of the reflections of what I've been trying to do and what I've learned from it, basically. So in places like Kashmir, I worked in Kashmir, in Afghanistan, in Myanmar, and other parts of South Asia, but my point of reference is obviously majorly Kashmir, because that's where I've done a lot of work in, and I'm currently also based there. We're talking about places with ongoing mental health crisis, different layers of trauma, helplessness, socio-economic crisis, drug menace, unemployment, internet suspensions, communication blockades, and you name it. A lot of it is really painful to see on a daily basis. So for me, peace psychology was this hopeful kind of a thing where I felt like maybe holistically, if we understood humans in their own context and tried to kind of support and take care of some of their needs, I think at least we can create some windows of calm. And I don't want to call it peace because I feel like that's a lot to say, but I feel like some windows of calm so that they can kind of understand what's happening to them. And in that, intersectionality has been very important to me. And that's why I've been working at the intersection of mental health, psychology, arts, conflict transformation, and peace building, especially with a localized, culturally relevant kind of an understanding. I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the themes I've been working with, because in the next 10 minutes, that's all I can do. Mental is political. Many times when I speak about it, people are like, why don't you just only talk about psychology? Don't talk about politics. I think the times we live in, it's increasingly going to be even more important to acknowledge that mental is political and vice versa, especially in conflict zones where individuals like me try to do something on the ground, but then you have an overarching political framework which impacts all aspects of your life, whether you like it or not. There's also a very heavy emphasis on this word, which I'm sure you've heard a lot: resilience. In the past couple of years, I've come to hate the word. I don't like it anymore, because I feel like there's just too much onus on the surviving communities to be resilient, to go on despite the chaos, despite the conflict. And that does not help. I'm still struggling with the word healing. I don't know if it really happens in conflict zones. I think most of the times we just try to put band-aids on the wounds because the trauma is really intrinsic, it's intergenerational. And sometimes, imagine I'm talking to somebody on phone today providing psychological first aid, and the internet and the phone lines get cut because of the political turmoil. The next time I speak with this person could be 3 months after, a year after, 15 days later, and the next time I speak with this person, I have to go back and start from point zero, which gets exhausting for both of us in the process. The next theme that I'll briefly touch upon is decolonization and contextualization. I know these are very heavy words that people have so many theories about. I'm not here to give you any theories. In my very simple, humble understanding, I feel like a lot of peace building field is still very colonized, and so is psychological support. And to begin with, we need to kind of decolonize a lot of these words. For instance, I studied in the West as well. So when I came back, I thought I was going to teach some fancy things to, people back home. So let's start with self-care. And as you would know, the current notions of self-care, Netflix and chill, that's actually not self-care. especially for community like ours, where community is a huge factor and individualism doesn't really exist. I mean, talk to women about self and they're like, what is that? And I'm not here to discredit the whole concept of self-care. I think it has its own importance. But in places like Kashmir, the notions of care and nurture and support comes from community. So you cannot actually see it in a silo. You have to see it within the context of the broader community. And in that, the contextualization is so important. The work I was doing in the US before I came in, I had to kind of put it away, get rid of my accent that I'd picked up because I'd been studying internationally for a while, and create new modules that I thought, could help people on the ground. And I've been trying to do that through a lot of experiential workshops, modules, seminars that take into consideration the local richness of art, culture, spirituality, creativity, and a lot of other things. Religion as well, I think that's an important factor. And there's often a debate between psychology and religion, when religion actually can be a huge psychological support, which is the case in Kashmir as well. The third theme, and something very close to my heart, is creating community-safe spaces for expression, dialogue, and interconnectedness. So the picture that you're seeing is actually from an initiative that I do. It's called Zundub. So Zundub is basically from the Kashmiri architecture. It used to be like a balcony kind of a room from where you could basically stargaze and moon gaze. Zoon means moon in Kashmiri, and dub is basically a room. So this is kind of a modern idea of a Zundub, but the initiative is called Zundub, and in that people come together and they share their narratives of what is happening to them psychologically, what is a conflict doing to them, what are their mental health needs and other needs. And they do it through different creative ways, through storytelling, through artistic expression. Art is an integral part of everything I do because I think that really helps at all levels. So because of COVID, Zundub is something that you could basically do anywhere. I've done it on the streets, in schools, in community places. But because of COVID last year, we were really restricted. So I had to do it in the basement of a local cafe who were very helpful and kind of hosted us for free. All my work in Kashmir is also free, so I have to also look for other community support from people. So this is from, I think, the Women's Day or the Mental Health Day that we tried to do this, where this is sometimes the first space or the only space for women especially who come together and express what is happening to them or their stories of abuse or domestic violence or psychological needs and their aspirations and hope for a peaceful future as well. As you would have seen, mental health, for instance, is an integral part of the work I do. It's not the only thing, but I think it's an important one. And there's still so much stigma attached to mental health. I once told my mom that I think I'm going through anxiety, and she was like, don't tell this to anyone, nobody will take you seriously. So the stigma is huge, and a lot of my energy and time on a daily basis back home goes into doing a lot of awareness campaigns on the destigmatization of mental health conversations, bringing people together, creating mental health working groups, sharing resources. We're talking about basic unawareness. People still don't know the difference between a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a counselor, a therapist, for instance. So in these 10, 12 years on the ground, I've also been trying to compile resources, especially who would offer their services pro bono to young people or students who especially cannot afford these things. Mental health conversation in itself is a privilege in places like Kashmir because there's so much trauma that a lot of people sometimes don't even know that they're going through mental health issues. So the destigmatization of it becomes even more important. The last theme that I just want to touch upon very briefly is counteracting the enforced normalization that comes with conflict, which leads to dehumanization. So for instance, the abnormal is the norm back home. Seeing people getting killed on a daily basis, shuttling between funerals and weddings, maybe sometimes in the same hour. It's all very normal. Back home, we sometimes joke about it. Like kids used to open the newspapers in the morning to see if somebody's gotten killed so that they can have a day off. So the normalization of conflicts is one of the most scariest things. And personally, it breaks my heart to see people going numb with the conflict. And it also creates a lot of dehumanization. And in that, a lot of foundational purpose of the work I do is to create a bridge where people can stand, pause, and ask themselves, is this normal? Because most often they don't even have that privilege or that safe space to ask themselves these questions. But if they do ask those questions to themselves, it creates a bit more of self-awareness and gives them space for emotional expression and meaning making. Who builds peace? In Kashmir, peace is sometimes also one of the most controversial words. So for a long time, people thought I was a counselor, and I let them think that way because I was like, okay, I can do my work on the ground. And it's also futuristic. You will hear people say, peace will happen one day. And it's also localized because, for instance, in the Kashmiri context, if you also ask like little kids, I did some peace education modules with little kids in schools, and even for them, peace is the political freedom, and the local word for that is azadi. I don't know who builds peace, but what I've been trying to do on the ground in terms of trying to create windows of peace and calm comes at a cost. It's exhausting, to say the least. With all the nice fancy things we've been looking at and learning about since morning, I've been working on the ground for a good 11 years now, and I feel exhausted. And this is not to say that I hate the work I do. I love the work I do. But it's absolutely heartbreaking on a daily basis because there's lack of support, there's lack of resources. I know Jonathan and other people talked about those things. But it's not just financial resources, there's a lack of psychological support. And that's why, for instance, even coming here and seeing all of you, I feel more energetic than I would have at home. There's increasing scrutiny back home, there's almost zero freedom of expression, and no self-care practices. And I have been affected by a lot of this personally. I started having anxiety in 2019 when there was like a huge shift in the political scenario in Kashmir. And since then, my health has been going down the drain. I've developed a few more issues. But that also made me realize the need of well-being and psychological approach towards peace building. I think so much of peace building is still socio-economic, physical protection kind of based, and it needs to be holistic, not just psychological. We need to look at digital, rights of people, legal rights of people. I do a lot of advocacy on YPS, WPS forums, especially for holistic protection of young people who don't just need socio-economic protection. They need a psychological protection, they need legal protection and all of that. Before coming here, I had to really think about what to speak here because I didn't also want to get into trouble back home. Yeah, a lot of people didn't know why I was coming here because I wasn't sure if I'd be allowed to even come here at the airport because that's how things are back home right now. And in that, mental health and psychological holistic approach to peace building is not a nice thing. I think this should be a fundamental thing to peace building. If not now, then when? I think pandemic has been a great reminder of a lot of these things. And moving forward, I think this is the only way to go. If you're going to invest in peace building and in people on the ground, you also need to take care of their basic needs, which includes psychological needs. And to end, I think there's always a movement happening. It's not like we need to create a new movement, but are there enough people listening? Are there enough people listening with empathy? Kashmir still is absent from a lot of international forums, papers, agendas that even I am a part of. And it's often called a disturbed area when it's actually a conflict zone with an ongoing subtle war. So as an international community, when we talk about these things, the movement is there, but why aren't people speaking? Because they don't have the privileges to always speak. And if they are speaking, are we listening enough? Are we listening with empathy, especially in the age of clicks and links, when we put up a link online and we feel like our job is done? If you want to be in peace building, apart from empathy and humility and other things, I think one thing has to be constant. You have to let your heart break. And you have to let it break enough for yourself to feel what these humans are feeling in their context, which is not happening very often today. I think that's the only way to go about building peace, piece by piece. I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.
And closing our session will be Graham Simpson, the Senior Peacebuilding Advisor at Interpeace.
So thank you very much for this opportunity, both to engage, to make the terrible mistake as the old white guy in the room of representing the voice of young people. But it's fantastic to see old friends again as well. In truth, when I presented the progress study on youth peace and security to missing peace to the Security Council, my starting point was to say if young people who had participated in the consultation processes that preceded that by over 2 years couldn't see and hear themselves in that process, then we had failed entirely. I think it was more by accident than by design in some ways that the UN got a report which was based really on very expansive listening exercises to young people, 281 focus groups across 44 countries, 35 country-specific studies, 8 or 9 regional consultation processes, consultations with member states, governments, as well as with all the UN entities and agencies. I think at the beginning, when this study was commissioned by a Security Council resolution, the anticipation was that this would be a desk study, that this would take 3 or 4 months. And I essentially said, I really don't understand how a project and an endeavor, which is essentially about the marginalization and exclusion of 1.8 billion young people in the world, can reproduce that pattern of exclusion. And so the first 6 months was raising money to try and do a proper kind of consultation process. I say this as a background because I really do want to discount the extent to which in what I say in the next 10 minutes that you're hearing me, and I'm hoping you will see and hear some of the extraordinary voices that we accessed from young people themselves. And one of the reasons I think this is very helpful to this conversation is because in a way, I suppose it's also quite challenging to the prevailing conversation about the geography of levels, the kind of conversation about the individual and the community and the local and the national and the international, as if this is about geography. And a very vertical kind of conversation. Even in John Paul's sort of triangle pyramid, there is a constant tension about how do you traverse this vertically, up and down, between policymakers and practitioners, et cetera, et cetera. And the first thing I'd like to say is that I think that we as a community, in some ways, and this goes to the spider's web, is that I think if we start thinking about those strands that connect those concentric circles, the connective tissue that he spoke about, I think we may start thinking about peace building endeavor very differently. And I think we may start thinking about what is the connective tissue, both between those levels and not just as geography, but sectorally as well. Peace building, human rights, gender studies, humanitarian action. And I think there's a really powerful way of thinking about peace building, not as a narrow field, but one which is smart at connecting all of these different sectors. And in some ways, the youth focus, I think, is perfect for illustrating this, because I think what young people demonstrated in everything we sort of heard from them was the transversal nature of their engagements, their lack of respect for these boundaries, their assertiveness about what they described as the violence of their exclusion, the intersectional lived experience of injustice, of being marginalized politically, economically, educationally, on the basis of gender, because of a human rights or a rights realization gap. In all these arenas of young people's lives, they were saying our patterns of exclusion and marginalization actually connect all these things. And so youth-led and youth-based peace building, in some ways, I think arguably provides us with an extraordinary connective tissue, which forces us to think very differently about the relationship between the local and the global, and the ways in which peace builders can traverse this terrain. I also think it's imperative for us to think about our own field, because in some ways there's been a fairly segmented conversation in the room about the practitioner world, about the engagement with policymakers, and about the role of scholarship. And I think working with that pyramid as a triangle, rather, which sees as one of its core missions effective integration of policy, practice, and scholarship, not a segmentation of that, and one in which is premised on the reciprocal learning between those three dimensions, that policy is improved by reference to creative practice, that scholarship as a way of distilling and understanding all of this can make an enormous contribution, and inevitably, scholars themselves will learn enormously from the practice of actors, the practitioner community, as will policymakers. So I wanted to start there and say that I think that this policy practice scholarship is one of those arenas of connective tissue, if we can connect those intelligently. And I think young people's peace building and youth-led peace building offers us another powerful illustration of that. The last thing I want to say about this is that I think there's another dimension to this. We heard a conversation earlier about simultaneity or sequencing. And I think there's something really incredibly important about thinking about the temporal frame. I'm not calling it either simultaneity or sequencing. The temporal frame, the way we think about time, by reference to youth, because I think it's an incredibly helpful thing to think about conflict and peace in transgenerational terms. And I think that that's really useful, not just as a matter of dealing with the past, but because I think it opens up a conversation about these levels and who builds peace, a very different conversation when we start talking about prevention. We start talking about thinking not just about past conflict, but about the aspiration to prevent future conflict. And I think that that changes this conversation in interesting ways. And I think that young people's peace building forces us into the space in very creative and interesting ways. The first thing I want to say is that at its heart, what we discovered when we were talking to young people was a fundamental trust deficit. An experience in which young people had lost trust in their governments, were increasingly losing trust in representative systems of democracy, which had not served them well. We're talking about trust deficits, not just about political participation, but a loss of trust in economic systems that excluded and marginalized them and restricted their opportunities. A loss of trust in institutions that ruled their lives. For young people, it was extraordinary to hear their primary description of the places where they met their states as being criminal justice and the security system, education, and to some extent in relation to the economy. But these were two critical areas in which young people saw their relationship to the state. And like peace processes, they said, this is all about us and entirely without us. That a youth-centered approach to DDR, a youth-centered approach to security sector reform, a youth-centered approach to all the issues in criminal justice reform, despite the fact that restorative justice has its origins in the juvenile justice systems. Young people were constantly saying this system actually inadvertently is constantly talking about us. Whenever we talk about former combatants, 90% of the time, don't quote the statistic, a huge amount of the time, we are talking about young people who are seen as the foot soldiers of conflict, et cetera, young people who have the most investment in future peace processes, and yet young people constantly talking about this as a pattern of exclusion and marginalization. Young people were also very articulate in saying to us, please don't ghettoize us. Don't just look for youth leadership in youth organizations. We are in women's organizations, we are in human rights organizations, we are in civic organizations, we are economic actors, we are in the communities being policed, and we are in the police. And this is a really powerful way of thinking again about the sort of intersectionality, this sort of way of thinking about the connection of these issues in young people's lived experience that I think was very important. Young people said about the development conversation, I was fascinated by the sense of anxiety and offense that John Paul spoke about when he saw the word reconciliation replaced with the word development. To understand the concern, but what young people were saying to us through a peace-building lens is they said, every SDG is a youth SDG. Don't consign us to the arenas of education or sport and culture. We actually have a real interest in the whole world, right? Young people were very powerful and articulate about saying, please don't tell us young people are the future. We are astute, we understand how the future is made, and we know that it's our action now that makes our future. Deal with us as here, as in the present, as active, as agents of political change, rather than as some deferred concern. I think this is very helpful. I think what it does is it helps us think about peace responsive approaches to humanitarian action, to economic and development practice, to food security, to health and human rights issues, because actually what young people are saying to us is all of these are dimensions of the coherent nature of the lives we want and the peace we see as valid, right? This is not just about the absence of violence, right? And I think that's really helpful because I also think it forces us past or into the space that Tanya referred to, that complex arena where we aren't just talking about the end of violence, the negative peace issue. We're talking about this discourse of positive peace and how we get there. I think young people are actually very articulate at describing the occupation of the space between these two things and the connectivity between them. And so in some ways, what young people were also saying to us was, until you deal with the violence of our exclusion, and they used this language, right? They used the language of violence of exclusion because they were talking about structural violence. They were talking about an understanding of violence, not just as physical threat, but as structural in their lives. They said, until you deal with the violence of our exclusion, you will never prevent the violence of extremism. And that was very powerful because the dominant discourse that young people were experiencing, I saw this when 75 member states stood up to affirm the report I just written. I suspect having read nothing of it, or maybe having done the word search for their country name to see if there was anything truly offensive. What they all did was they said they supported, and then probably half of that member state sort of public statement was oriented around youth inclusion and participation and empowerment and affirmation, whether you like these words or not. But the other half was saying, actually, this is a backdoor route to counterterrorism. This is because actually there is a dominant discourse, which is that the prevailing vision of young people is a young man with a gun and a young woman consigned to the status of passive victimhood. And these dominant discourses that associate young people with violence have also produced a series, these stereotypes have produced a series of policy panics driven by the perception that all young people are going to join extremist armed groups. It's based on absolutely no evidence. It is a tiny sliver of young people who find their way into these political, criminal, and violent underworlds. And yet we invest massive amounts of resources in securitized approaches to young people in lieu of saying, where do we find the innovative practice, the creative contribution to peace building? And not all young people are peace builders. They're just getting on with their lives, smoking some weed, doing a whole lot of other things. But the fact is, there's a massive opportunity to invest in the upside, and instead all of the resources are channeled into securitized views of young people as a threat. And I would say there's a strategic value here in the focus on investing in youth resilience rather than investing in youth purely on the basis of risk. But I say this mindful of the fact the notion of resilience is also one that needs to be contested and recognized, because young people were very consciously saying to us, don't romanticize our ability to survive the terrible things that happen to us, as if there is no responsibility for states and multilaterals and international NGOs to work with us and work for us. This notion of survivalist resilience is deeply problematic. It's part of a humanitarian and disaster recovery discourse that young people themselves were critical of. But they were also very mindful of a language of resilience which was transformative. Young women who are saying, as economic actors, when men go to war, we are claiming a new space out of the gender stereotypes that we typically occupy. That is resourceful, it is resilience, and it changes our lives. It's transformative of our gender identities and the boundaries of our lives and the horizons of them. So I think there's a creative space, Ufra, in my view, for thinking about resilience differently and listening to how people describe resilience and seeing it as a spectrum rather than one thing. I'm not going to get through half of this. So let me pick the couple of last things I want to say. The one is that having listened into this, I think, incredible youth voice, the international community then kicks in with its usual industrial machinery to think about how do we implement this and how do we localize it. And immediately you have the sense of this template of a policy framework that has to be dropped down on country contexts. And actually the conversation about locally owned, youth-led, youth-centered approaches to peace building offer enormous opportunity that this approach really fails to navigate. It doesn't mean that a global policy agenda of the sort, if it's driven by the right participatory and inclusive process, isn't really important. But the danger when we say this is actually only about youth participation in peace processes, how many bums on seats of young people, the quota of young people, not unimportant, but if it's only about that, or the protection of young people from physical violation, then I think we miss a whole lot of the things that in a textured, nuanced way, the local youth peace builders are telling us what they want and what they need. And in our view, we are hearing young people say, there is an amazing way in which we can reshape the nature and orientation of forward-looking transitional justice. That's a key dimension of youth participation in peace processes. Education for resilience is our terrain. It's all about us. Let us help shape and define those curricula and those priorities so that they're not just about vocational objectives and jobs, but they connect us to meaning in our lives and participation in our lives. The climate justice conversation is for young people is not just the big picture issues. It's also about, it drives urbanization. These produce informal settlements. Those are predominantly youth places in which young people are located. We need to start thinking about city engineering and rethinking by reference to youth, so that we're not just dealing implicitly with young people, we are seeing this demography in place. The securitization issue. And one of the most powerful things, which is the most ironic, is in one of the policy papers, Youth Written and Led, that's on our website, Outside the Box. It's amazing to hear the United Network of Young Peace Builders and someone from that organization saying, ironically, young people are consulted in this whole process. And when it comes to designing national action plans or to a roadmap or a youth coalition, suddenly young people are completely ignored. They're out of the picture. And that this becomes government owned and government driven, completely counterproductive. So there are fascinating ways of thinking about this. The last thing I'll say is that in relation to this, and by the way, I think that one of the dimensions of this that is inherently treated as threatening and yet is one of the most critical arenas in which young people play out their roles as change agents is in the arenas of protest and dissent that are often most threatening to governments and most worrying even to peace builders. Yeah. They are the leaders in the movement around decolonization of peace building. They are leaders in the demand for climate justice. They are driving the global conversations about systemic racism. They are leaders in the gun control and weapons control movements. And they are very often leaders in the peace building discourse that gets so little attention in the midst of peace processes, as Brandon mentioned, around social justice, around social and economic empowerment. Two last points, I promise. The first is this. There is an incredible dimension to this, which is about political imagination, that change agency, that leadership in social movements, the change agency. And I just want to give you, just give you very concrete examples of the amazing way in which young people were talking about this. DDR, it's all about us, reintegration of former combatants. Well, 90% of the time, again, forgive the statistics, a turn of phrase, a whole lot of the time, young people are being reintegrated into elder-led communities in which they feel re-marginalized, in which they feel, imagine, young people said, if it was youth organization and youth-centered approaches that provided the new housing, institutional integration, places of belonging for young former combatants, how would that change the way in which DDR works and whether it works? The second issue, and Brandon made reference to this earlier by reference to Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, South Africa, Bosnia. In South Africa, we refer to the generation who came after the constitutional democracy, after the end of apartheid, as the Born Frees. Whether it's the Born Frees in South Africa, whether it's second generation youth survivors of the massacres in Srebrenica, or whether it's the young people in Northern Ireland, very often what they're doing is they're saying, you made this agreement, you and sometimes a previous youth cohort sold us out on a whole lot of things. Our lived experience entitles us to a right of review. We want to look at these peace agreements. Imagine the political imagination of a youth sector today saying, let's look at these peace settlements and let us tell you what's working and what isn't. Let us tell you what we wouldn't have sacrificed in the political compromises. Let us engage in a reflective exercise. I think that would be an unbelievable process, however scary it might be. So I'm going to leave it there with the kind of youth sort of political imagination. But I do want to say the one thing that I left out here is that I really think the conversation about prevention, which starts to think about transgenerational memory and transgenerational implications of this, which starts to see civic trust, the rebuilding of trust, and recognizes the legitimacy of youth mistrust of their governments, that we need to associate the word trust with the words trustworthy. And trustworthiness should be the objective so that we don't insist on trust by communities at the expense of trustworthiness by their governments. I think that these issues of civic trust and institutional reform are fundamental. They're very rooted in the transitional justice field. There is a whole lot in the conversation about prevention, which I think may well change the way we think about who builds peace and how. And I don't think we're doing that. I think we're talking mostly in retrospect about conflict and damage. Sorry, I'm sorry.
Just while you gather your questions and the runners with the microphones come together, if Graham's report, sets us off with the cheesy puns, with the missing piece, I wanted to carry on in that grand tradition and say this panel has, brought together many pieces, and those have reverberated with this morning, about how peace is political. We've heard how education is political, the mental is political. These are processes about us and absolutely without us, and people-to-people work is hard and not soft. So let's take a round of questions at the back.
Thank you. Thank you. Regarding international support for local peace building, people might think that Sri Lankan war was over. Yes, one war was over, But in the last 13 years, the war-torn area has been hyper-militarized. And the north is just being ruled by the army. The south is ruled by the elected president and the government. How the UK is related to this, I want to tell you that from 2009 to 2019, I have got a list of high commissioners from Colombo, I mean, British foreign high commissioners, ambassadors to Sri Lanka based in Colombo. They visit the highly militarized north, especially Jaffna, and meet the army commander and shakes hands and listen to his lies, or we are building peace in the north. This list. And you have got photographs of 2019 visit by British High Commission persons here. This I took to 2019 to my UNA UK branch meeting also. I showed them that they are shaking hands and listening to the lies. This is international support for the militarization of hyper-militarization of war-torn north for the last 13 years. Right, okay. Regarding peace education also, I can say the UK, like other countries that are engaged in international development for development, I can say they are spending money to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is doing this in peace education. Their textbooks for the last 60 years or for the last 74 years have been instigating hatred among the ethnic majority about the ethnic minorities and religious minorities. But the UK is supporting Sri Lanka in so many development funding is going on there. Education textbooks, UNESCO even made a mistake, tripped up. UNESCO was tripped up by the Sri Lankan textbooks. I don't want to take a long time. Others might have questions, but I am just telling there are so many things. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll take a couple. Oh, for the back for the Zoom questions.
Well, actually, I'm going to ask a question.
Oh, sorry.
But because your presentation, Graham, was fantastic, and I want to sort of push it a bit further to you and to all the panel. What does it tell us about us that we don't take seriously the voice of the youth? Because we also have a youth or a young person within us. And so that's my big question. So it's not only about listening to the youth out there, but to that little eye that we have who are full of curiosity. And so how can the education sector help to nurture that voice? And if we change perspective and see that there is a youth within us, how would that change the relationship between the international partners and the donors on the ground? I think trying to bring to the fore a youth perspective in ourselves as peace builders could be really important and could create more horizontal relationships with the youth outside. I wonder if you could reflect a bit on that.
Thank you. This is directed towards Simpson, and maybe there's a conversation you and I can have a little bit after this, maybe during a coffee break. But I'm finding a gray area about what it means to be a young person. So I'm with my Rotary Fellow Scholars from the University of Bradford, and there's about 12 of us here, and we're basically encouraged to be peace negotiators, peacemakers, I guess, in the future, and we're considered young. I've been referred to as a young person, and we're in our 30s. But I also work with students from Ukraine. I'm a member of the Rotaractor Lviv International, And they're 18, 17, 20 young people too. And there's like this weird, like this middle gray area about where the young people are and where's the cutoff between these areas. And I'm just like, why, as I said earlier, this may be a discussion better for us. You and I can have do a deep dive into a little conversation about this definition. But and then there's these age categories. But I find it in a position where I'm just like, I don't even have an answer for myself about what is it like to be a young person working peace negotiations or peace work and being like, okay, where's the cutoff? when do I stop being young? And where does this dialogue start and end?
You take one or two more and let the, so we have one more here and then at the back. More.
Thank you very much. My name is Nancy, and it's a pleasure to be here and to listen to your insightful what you're doing and your presentations. I would first of all like to start with a comment and then maybe a question. I like what you said, John, about the tension between the standards and the indicators, the evaluations that they use to measure peace building on the ground and what is actually happening. And I think that's one of the problems that the whole aspect or concept of local peace building is having a challenge, because in many communities, peace building cannot be measured in these big, indicators that we measure them in. It is sometimes, the women peace group waking up early in the morning, walking long distance to another community to check on a fellow woman who has been abused or going through domestic violence. And then some of these issues cannot be measured and quantified. So if we continue to quantify some of these in these big standards and indicators, we fail to see the impact the communities are making. We fail to see some of these everyday elements of peace building. And I think that that's something that needs to be looked at and really be addressed. And my question then goes on to the fact that you mentioned about it is those affected by conflict who are the least resourced. I would also like to add that perhaps also it is those who are the front line of peace building who also often find themselves least resourced, because often funding is going to the INGOs and the bigger NGOs, but not trickling down to the communities and the grassroots groups that are doing the work. And this relates to my work that I did in Liberia with local infrastructures for peace. And often majority of these local groups were talking about the fact that we write the proposals, we take it for funding, but we are not funded. We are not funded, we are told, because we don't understand the funding requirements. We are not able to produce the reports that they are expecting, or we don't have a building. One local group said, because we don't have a building, we were denied funding. But we also clearly know that these are the groups that are really building peace, who are the front line of building peace. So how do we ensure that such support gets to the right people on the ground so that peace can be achieved?
So we'll have our panelists respond to either.
Pass the parcel. Music's just stopped. Well, I'll comment on a couple of them. Our colleague from Sri Lanka, thank you for your points. I mean, I very much hear your pain and anger in what you say. And I think this is a terrible contradiction we see in so much of the global environment. The paradox between countries that throw money into militarized responses, at the same time put money into peace building responses. So our organization is, like many, dependent to a large degree on Swedish money, and we get a lot of British money, two of the biggest arms producers in Europe. there's a contradiction there. So governments are far from consistent. They contain the multitudes that we all contain. So they will pursue creative and enlightened policies, and UK and Sweden have been two of the most creative, enlightened supporters of peace building, development, many of the norms and standards that we aspire to see spread more widely. But they're also sadly implicated in some of these more militarized responses. So it's a contradiction that we have to constantly challenge. Simon Fisher earlier today spoke about the Rethinking Security Initiative, which I think is one example of a very powerful process of thinking about alternatives, and there are others. So it sadly is something that needs constant endeavor, and we'll be struggling to change throughout our lives, and we'll only get so far, that's for sure. On the question around indicators of change, you yourself used the everyday indicators, which maybe is drawn from, I think, the extraordinary work of colleagues who do work on the everyday indicators of peace. And I know that organizations like our own have been pushing our own understanding of what it is to monitor and evaluate the impact of our work. It's a question we constantly get asked by donors. It's a question we constantly ask ourselves. And we've been fortunate to learn from our partners at Safer World about some very innovative work they've done about outcome harvesting. And it's an approach that we've adopted that is about telling the story of the change from the perspective of the change makers, and not just being tied to the sort of macro level indicators. I think the more we're able to articulate and tell these stories, the more we make the change comprehensible and real to people for whom the work that we do is often a very distant and intangible concept. So there's more work to be done there, but it is beginning to happen a little bit. And then the point about the frontline peace builders being least resourced, I couldn't agree with you more. The challenge is how to mediate the resources to them in ways that they're able to act on it. And I think it's a big part of the work that we as peace building organizations have to do in the years to come. So no easy answer, you know that as well as I do, if not better, but it's good to be reminded of the need to constantly address that.
Okay, I can briefly just say, in thinking about Andre's question, I was thinking about my kids. So I have 2 young kids, and I was thinking they have a very different approach to, like, failure for them is learning, right? Failure is learning. And I think that we possibly, this is just a possible reflection, don't possibly take youth seriously in the points that Graham articulated so strongly, because that would require a real acknowledgement of a lot of failure within our peace building and development and humanitarian initiatives over decades, right? And the measurement systems that our colleague referred to also don't enable that opportunity to discuss and reflect on failure and to learn from and share failure, right? And to see failure as a learning process, which it so is for young children. And maybe that's a question too in this, like, at what point do we stop seeing failure as, or stop, it's not that young people see failure as part of their learning, it just is, right? So at what point do we learn to not share our failures, I guess? And maybe that's some kind of boundary, I don't know. We'll let you answer that question of where youth ends. And then what else oh yeah, I think, can't remember how this connected to, oh yes, so this around militarization and the roles that governments play in funding peace and also in funding war. I think as I was listening to you, Jonathan, talk about that, I was thinking back to John Paul Liederach's presentation in the morning and the web and this idea of an ecosystem and interconnection, and just wondering, well, how do we think about that ecosystem model without a structural and geopolitical analysis like Andre was talking about earlier, that acknowledges that, like, if we're thinking about a web in a particular context, that, you know, an actor outside of that context can blow the whole web down, possibly. So how do we account for geopolitics within that ecosystem? of connections and where does a structural analysis come into that very inspiring way of understanding peacemaking. So that's a question that I was reflecting on. It's not an answer at all, but I do wonder how we, and I may be complicity, so maybe we think about some of those connections within webs as ways of showing us the different ways in which we're complicit in these systems that we sometimes fail to acknowledge. And we have failed to acknowledge the funding of militarization by actors that are also engaged in peace building until we had the comment from our colleague from Sri Lanka. So I think that's really useful that, that she's brought that in. So, yeah.
To your comment, sorry, I forgot your name. I struggle with that as well because I'm in my 30s as well. And many times I fit the criteria of, being somewhere or given the expertise, but then I'm told, oh, but you're older than 30 now, so you can't come here, right? And I don't think I've resolved that in my head, but I've also asked myself, how does it matter? And this is not to give you quick solutions or to myself. Why does it matter? And is there a transformation in the role? So for instance, I started doing peace building work when I was 16, 17. So I was a cliched young youth person running an organization, leading it and for youth and everything. But now that I'm in my 30s, so how does my role change? And in that way, what is the accountability and responsibility given maybe the kind of access I have now, which I didn't have 15 years ago, or the privileges maybe that I have earned over time? How does that then impact the work I can be doing with other young people? So in Kashmir, for instance, a lot of my work is with young people. Because I feel like I understand their issues better, because that was the age when I started thinking about these things and all of that. So I started, for instance, with the center I have, there's a mentorship program I run right now, which is basically for young peace builders and young psychology students across South Asia. And it's pro bono. It's a 6-month pilot that I'm doing right now. And I've been doing this work in the past 10 years. I just realized it makes more sense to bring people together and do it in a more structured way. Also requires less energy. So in that way, I'm now realizing that my work is also of a facilitator, which has been that on the ground. So I don't know. I don't think I'm answering your question, and it's not meant to be answered. I think these are just some questions that we have to keep asking yourselves. Why am I doing the work I'm doing? At least this is something I ask myself every day, especially when I'm depressed and hopeless on the ground. I try to remind myself of the beginning of the journey, why I decided to walk on the path of peace building, coming from a conflict zone, having born, there and grown up there and all of that. So I think the tiny shifts between your role is something that will define how you can be more impactful in the work that you're doing.
Andrea, your question is a really tough one. I'll suggest 3 things. What does it say about us as a peace building sector, community, that we aren't listening to or aren't capable of listening to young people broadly? The first is, I think that there's a tyranny of measurement that has shaped our inclination to risk aversion. That very often the innovation and creativity of youth-driven peace building is responsive. It's sometimes, young people themselves acknowledge they don't always have great ways of measuring, but it also presumes that you need to know where you're coming out before you start. We log frame it, the projectization conversation. I think that discourse is anathema. I think that when I talked about the triangle of policy, practice, and scholarship, I think if we look at ourselves in that space, we will see that there are protocols in all of those 3 arenas that are designed to marginalize and exclude young people. Whether it's the uniforms we have to wear when we step into the international policy space, whether it's the speaking order, the amount of time you get to speak, how you say what you say. All of these conversations, I think there is a whole set of protocols that we buy into, in a lot of ways that I think compounds that problem. What it says about us is that we are depriving ourselves of this extraordinary peace-building discourse that traverses the levels that we constantly talk about siloing our activity, because it's a naturally transversal arena for young people to work across these arenas. They work across different phases of conflict, early intervention models and prevention approaches, escalation of conflict, continuation of conflict, guarantees of non-recurrence, and I think that that's a slightly constraining view of prevention, but and then young people's role in post-conflict reconciliation, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think our ignorance of them is that we lose incredible opportunities to work across those different phases. Young people are also working across different typologies of conflict, recognizing that gender-based violence, criminal violence, political violence, terrorism are often fungible arenas of conflict and violence, and that we need to understand not just how violence might or conflict might repeat itself, but how it transmutes, how it evolves, how new patterns of exclusion create new patterns of dissent and conflict. I think we deprive ourselves of that. And then lastly, I think we lose sight of this incredibly creative space that I've talked about, which is about the opportunities young people present for us to think about prevention differently, beyond just guarantees of non-recurrence, through institutional reform and the building of civic trust, the ideas of young people in the future and future leadership and those sorts of issues, transgenerational memory, memorialization, trauma. There's a whole bunch of stuff. So I think it's just terminal for the field, frankly, if you want to know what it makes of us. And I think at the end of the day, what it does is it produces a loss, an incredible loss in our failure to translate the demographic dividend of youth as a proportion, a very significant proportion of conflict-affected societies, our ability to translate that demographic dividend into a peace dividend. I think that the constant sort of thrust is young people are a huge number, and so we must deal with them. But we're not understanding why. We're not understanding that this is not just it's not just inherently a good because of the demographic size. It's got to be more than that. And then the last thing I want to say is, I think we have to be really careful that we don't, in as much as I've said we can't afford to demonize young people, I think we have to be incredibly careful of romanticizing them as well. I mean, I had a throwaway line that was cute about that, but I think it's really important. And for the peace building field, maybe most importantly, let's not patronize them, right? So they're a microcosm of the wider society, and we need to recognize that and engage with that. On the issue of who is a youth and who isn't, I think that, our line on this, and there's a really interesting section in the progress study on youth, peace and security on these questions. There's no consistency in international law on this. There's lots of problematic issues. So there's no neat answer there. We reached the point where we said we need to think of youth as a time of passage rather than a passage of time. That it's about the status that young people need in order to acquire adult status, whether it's about jobs, education, housing, land. There are a whole lot of things that are triggers, rites of passage. And the more young people are deprived of those things, the more they are stuck in what Alcindor Honwana calls an arena of waithood, that uncertain arena that you feel you occupy. I think we should embrace it. I think for those of us who are older than that, we should embrace it, because one of the other things about the youth sector is that it's constantly about reinventing and redeveloping and reproducing yourself. It's one of the few identity-based categories in which people do graduate out of that category and are constantly thinking about what does that impose on us as a peace-building community, as responsibility for building the next generation, the next cohort that follows. So I think that's a creative space rather than a risky one.
Liz, when are we due back for the closing plenary? How long do we have for the break?
About 2 minutes.
All right.
We are seriously over time. I don't know how long the next plenary session is going to take when we've got Phil online, but we will obviously have to think of closing at 6 rather than 5:45, which we had originally. So, well, let's give ourselves 10 minutes for tea.
And before our
if
micro
you're
break,
thinking of going, and I have a few people leaking away, please, would you leave your name badge on the registration table where you registered when you came in? Thanks.